Those soothing alkalizers and alphas. For the best tasting tuna, get Starkist.
Free inside Frosty O's and Lucky Charms.
Well, Florida was a battleground. The war involved public schools. The conflict mushroomed when teachers across the state went on strike. The 1968 walkout was the first of its kind in our nation's history. Never before had teachers left classrooms on such a massive scale.
In 1966, a former high school principal became executive director of the Florida Education Association. His name was Phil Constance.
The teachers in Florida just really were frustrated, and every time they'd hear somebody talk about doing more for education, they knew it was just talk, and they'd get madder.
The schools were not well built. They were old.
There was just no question in most instances. You just did whatever the principal said, period, regardless of what the request might be.
We walked out because we didn't have books like we should have had.
Teacher was a very insignificant figure. I found this town loyal to teachers and very kind to me, but we were not allowed any of the decision making.
Question of more money just on our salaries was not a priority item at all. It was basically just for better conditions for the students and not necessarily for us, which of course would have meant better conditions for us.
In 1966, the crisis in Florida's public schools was made worse by the new governor, Claude Kirk, the first Republican to hold statewide elective office since Reconstruction. In June 1967, Governor Kirk, though he had been elected on a promise to make Florida's schools #1, proposed to cut $150 million from the state's budget for public education. FEA responded by calling a one-day meeting of all Florida's teachers at the Tangerine Bowl in Orlando.
We found out we just didn't have to take it anymore. We didn't have to. As long as we could get ourselves together and agree and stand together, we could make changes.
So we went down to the Tangerine Bowl, and I remember our public relations people were really concerned about whether or not we would have enough people show up at the Tangerine Bowl. And so they had arranged to have everybody seated on the west side of the Tangerine Bowl so that when the television cameras worked the crowd, you know, they would look full and everything. And because we didn't know how many would show up.
Then the morning of that, I remember driving into Orlando. I got there early. And even early, there was beginning to be obvious that there was going to be a traffic problem. All of a sudden, cars from every direction, buses, in tandem, driving down the road. It stopped the police and trying to direct the traffic. And it was a tremendous sense of pride in what we were about.
We were certain that with solidarity and all of us together, we'd be able to change things in education in Florida.
In spite of pressure for an immediate job action, Phil Constance asked teachers to turn the other cheek.
They were very angry at that time. The teachers in the schools were way ahead of us. If we were the leaders, they were ahead of us because they had had more than we had had maybe, and they didn't want to mess around. They thought it was time for us to take the steps that were necessary to do whatever we could to turn the state around.
2 weeks after the Tangerine Bowl meeting, Governor Kirk established a blue ribbon panel on educational reform. The panel's recommendations were the focus of a special session of the legislature during the fall. It recessed without coming up with an adequate program. Spurred on by its locals, FEA began to consider another option. Florida's teachers were asked to submit their resignations en masse to FEA's leadership for use at a chosen moment.
They said, I will resign my job if that's what it takes to bring education in line. I was proud of my profession for the stand they took because they knew that we could lose our job, we could lose our home, But because we honored the profession so much, and we wanted our children to have the proper education, and we knew Florida wasn't at the top, and we had everything to make Florida at the top if we could just get the legislature and the governor to go along with us.
On February 19, 1968, 35,000 resignations from Florida teachers were activated. It was the first statewide teachers' strike in U.S. history.
I'll never forget the governor of Florida flying in from California, because he was not in the state at the time, and announcing to everyone that he was going to come to Miami if I would invite him to speak to the 6,000 teachers in Marine Stadium, and he would convince them, if he could only have the opportunity to talk to them, that they had made a mistake, and convince them to go back to the classroom. And he spoke. And there was silence in that stadium. And they listened. And listened courteously, listened politely. But when he was all finished, there wasn't a teacher who stirred from his or her seat or stood up and said, "Governor, I'm going back." Because they knew what was at stake. We were talking about the future of education in this state.
For 3 weeks it continued, but to no avail.
It did not end. It dribbled out. And finally, we released the local leadership to negotiate the return of their teachers.
I think in large measure it was responsible for Claude Kirk being a one-term governor.
We gained a great deal during the walkout. I think many people who are politically savvy in Florida realize that the teachers now were truly determined that we were going to try to get a fair shake for schools. We did start getting more money from the state legislature. I think it was what helped set the stage for later in '74 getting the collective bargaining law, because I don't think they wanted to have a walkout again.